Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Julia here from Inspira Advantage. We're an admissions consulting company dedicated to helping deserving students get into the school of their dreams. We've got an awesome webinar mapped out for you today, all about mapping out your application narrative. Just to kind of jump into our table of contents, we'll touch on what an application narrative is, determining your application narrative, how to start developing your narrative, ensuring that your application tells a cohesive story, and tips for developing an impactful narrative. And then we're going to jump into our Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar that are coming to mind, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will get to them when we get to the designated Q&A portion, and we'll get our panelists to answer those for you. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so it'll be sent out to all attendees tomorrow morning. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Another thing that I want to point out, please make sure that the questions that you ask are on-topic questions to what we're talking about. We don't want to kind of get off track because it makes it hard for our panelists to answer those questions. So please kind of keep it on topic. Other than that, let's go ahead and just introduce. This is just a little bit about us. I kind of mentioned what we do and our purpose before, but I just want to touch on our experts. Today we have Nate and Elle here. Elle will be joining us later, but Nate, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Nate. I'm a fourth year MD-PhD student at the Keck School of Medicine, USC Caltech Program. I've been with Inspira for a little bit over, I think about a year and a half now, actually. Time sort of flies. And I've worked with different candidates all throughout the admissions process. On the other side of things, I've served on the interview committee for 4 years now and interviewed dozens of candidates, and I have 1 year experience on the admissions committee for USC. So I like to think I have a good idea on what goes on behind the magic curtain, and can hopefully give you some insights onto pointers for crafting the strongest application narrative that you can.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nate. Okay, so let's get started with what is an application narrative?
Yeah, so your application narrative is the story you tell medical school admissions with your application as a whole. It is focused on what aspects your application really seeks to communicate to the committee. When I am first going through this with candidates, I like to sort of explain, you want to holistically paint a picture of yourself to the admissions committee of who you are as a person and why you will be an asset to their medical school as a future medical student and an asset as a future physician. I think overall, thinking about an application narrative is how do we start to connect these individual pieces of the larger application together? So zooming out and looking at everything from sort of the bird's eye perspective, how does this all connect? What is sort of my strategy or aim, if you will, into getting into medical school?
Okay, so then let's touch on determining your application narrative.
Yeah, so sort of like I just started to get into, but there are lots of components that go into an application. And I think this is applicable for medical school, but it's obviously applicable to any kind of professional school you're applying to, whether that's PA school or veterinary school. There are many similar components amongst the application. So focusing on our medical school example, the main components are the primary application. So this includes your background, your coursework with transcripts, a work and activities section that tends to cover about 15 different work and activities that you choose to highlight, letters of evaluation or letters of recommendations from professors, supervisors, people you've worked with that know you really well, personal statement, which is really the opportunity that you get to humanize your application and is really an excellent opportunity to sort of build in those connections. And then the essays that fall under the category of any other additional essays with the primary application, but also with the secondary applications, you have the opportunity to start to really get in things more specifically with the essays. So a little bit of an overview on each of those sections. Background information is really just sort of the formalities of the application process, making sure they have all the pertinent information like addresses, who you are, your coursework and transcripts. Those are the components of the application that sort of allow you to tell them that you have prepared for the rigors of medical school or whatever professional school journey you are about to embark on, as well as opportunities to sort of explain the different courses that maybe you've chosen to take and distinguish yourself as a candidate. The work and activities section, this is 15 slots for you to cover jobs, volunteer work, clubs, sports, any other activities you've been involved in. There's opportunities to even put hobbies in there, which some applicants always feel surprised. And I'm like, oh yeah, go ahead, put down a hobby. I put down my application that I was a yoga instructor. And you would be surprised how many people along the interview trail wanted to talk about yoga rather than wanted to talk about my hospital volunteering. So you can really go through and like actually put in some of those things that start to humanize you and make you look like a well-rounded human being and not just the ideal perfect medical school applicant. The letters of evaluation are something you have a little bit less control over in terms of content, but you do have control over who you ask. And sometimes really making that connection with the things that you want to highlight that are really important to your application narrative as a whole. If there were courses that were really important, there were experiences that were really important and really formative to your journey to medical school or whichever professional school you're applying into, getting in with those professors who were part of those really forming steps to have them write you those letters of evaluation. Always make sure that they're willing to write you a strong letter of evaluation, and they should be pretty straightforward with you and communicative if they're able to write you a strong letter of evaluation. It's very rare for a professor to ever say anything negative. They tend to let you know if they're not comfortable writing a letter of evaluation. And sometimes it's nothing personal at all. They just have a lot of students that they have to write letters of evaluation for. The personal statement, this is really your primary opportunity to start to craft the narrative overall. You've given them all this information and they have all this data on you, but you really haven't had quite so much an opportunity with the words to start to tie everything together and tie everything in. That is one thing that makes the personal statement a really important opportunity for you to sort of start to build the foundation of your application narrative. And that's something that you're hopefully going to just start as a foundation and then carry into your secondary applications and then later on into your interviews. We want to see things that are consistent. We want to feel like we've got to know you from the very beginning of the application. And we've seen you demonstrate those characteristics, and we know and trust that those characteristics will make you a really good future physician, an asset to whichever medical school you're matriculating at.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nate. That was so comprehensive. We'll touch on how to start developing your narrative.
Yeah, so I think this is something that a lot of people sort of struggle with at first, is figuring out how do I zoom out and look from a whole, what is my application narrative or angle? There are a couple things you can do that can first help you sort of identify that angle. Start to think about the qualities or traits that you exemplify that make you a great medical school candidate and future doctor. You don't have to in an application check off every single one of those boxes. The AAMC lists a ton of core competencies. We don't expect you to be able, in the tight amount of word space that you are given, to address every single one of those core competencies. Pick a few that are really emblematic of who you are and that you exemplify and that you can show. This is an important quality to me. My experiences back this up. This is how I can demonstrate it. And I think we'll get on in a little bit to how you show those rather than tell those. Yeah. Can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so like I just mentioned, the AAMC lists 15 core competencies. There's some broader categories. We have our thinking and reasoning competencies, which cover critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, scientific inquiry, written communication, scientific competencies, going to living systems, human behavior, Can we try the next slide, Julia? I think there might be some more. Oh, wait, sorry, go back one. So I think these are really abstract concepts. And I don't think it is going to do you any favors in your application to explicitly say, I am a critical thinker. You want to start to get the admissions committee to read between the lines. We like to think we have this magical insight that allows us to take this application where you're telling us all these stories. And for me, from one of those stories that you told me to go, I see that they're displaying critical thinking. They just showed me that they're a critical thinker. It's like this game of silent communication between you as a candidate and the admissions committee. I think sometimes I joke that you're like playing into their vanity. We like to think like we have this stroke of insight and genius that we can see from this application that this person's going to be a good future physician because I can see into the story and read between the lines and see that they're a critical thinker. So I think that comes down a little bit to like part of the game of communicating. So think about ways through stories, less explicitly and more implicitly, you can provide that evidence that you fit with these competencies. And this is just a high level highlight of some of those competencies. There are tons of competencies that you can go to for inspiration. And remember, it's not an exhaustive list. There are other things that make great future doctors. And if those things resonate with you more than the AAMC's list, go for them. It's all about authenticity in creating an application narrative. Cool. Yeah, so I think we sort of covered on this point, but having a cohesive application narrative is essential to paint a picture of who you are as a candidate and what you have to offer to the schools you apply for. It's creating that holistic story or theme of your application, and that theme is going to sort of create that angle of why you for medical school. Yeah, so what is it about you that makes you the ideal candidate? Again, you can sort of go through some of those ideas. What makes you unique? What makes you different? When I get to this question, I like to think of asking myself or asking the students that I'm working with. If I were to ask you sort of the question, why you and not another applicant for medical school? What makes you unique and well-suited? Yeah, so step 3, organizing your thoughts using your competencies, experiences, and main themes as anchors. Begin putting together the pieces of your application. And ensuring that your application tells a cohesive story. So remember that your application should be focusing on your journey to medical school. Look at this journey as though it's a plot for a movie. When and where, how does it start? So I think I talk a lot with my students when we are developing the personal statement. A great place to start from 90%, not all personal statements, but 90% of them, is start in the beginning. Give it to me chronologically. It makes it really easy to follow when you're working with such a tight space. And then you have to be really particular. You don't have a huge amount of space to go into in the personal statement. So you have to be really particular with which experiences and events have caused you to make certain choices and pursue specific goals and brought you to medicine. Another really important point, how did these experiences help you with growth, character development? How did they shape you? What did you learn from them? And where do you want this journey to lead? So I'm going to pause here for just one second because there's something that I wanted to take some time to discuss. I did a webinar, I think about a year ago now, about extracurricular activities. And a question I always get is, how do you decide which extracurricular activities to do? No one expects you to be a super person, a superhuman, and do everything. There's simply too much. So I think the most important thing is when you're picking between extracurriculars for your application, pursuing your passions, allowing them to figure out what you're passionate about is always going to come across way more interesting in an application and in your interviews than an activity that you absolutely hated. We can always tell if you didn't like that activity and you just like did it to check that box and you didn't enjoy it. For me, and I think that comes like there are certain experiences where you have this like diminishing returns coming back to you. For me, I was like doing hospital volunteering, and I did 200 hours of hospital volunteering, and then I had like another 80 hours to go to finish this program. And I had to make some decisions between either continuing at that or getting a part-time job teaching science to fifth graders. And I didn't fully complete the program, the hospital volunteering. I capped out at 200. I decided to switch over to the other job because I realized that was as much as I really could get out of that experience. I had stopped growing in that experience. And the next 2 years that I spent working with the fifth graders, I had an incredible time. Every time I went into the classroom, there's something about their just like wonder for science. And you're just like, we did some dissections and some strawberry DNA. It was always a fun experience for me to do, and it really helped me work on my scientific communication skills. Because fifth graders are actually a great population for you to be able to communicate little tidbits of science in a way that is understandable and accessible, but still building foundational knowledge. So that's my little soapbox there. I think you pick in the beginning, pick those experiences that you're really passionate about, and those will lead to the character development and growth, especially if you're an early candidate. Um, and another little brownie points that I like to add on is like the overall story is like, I'm demonstrating this trait. I'm showing you that I have this trait that makes me a good future physician. This is this experience that backs that up. This is what I learned from that experience. And the extra cherry on top, if it's applicable, this is how I plan to continue this experience in medical school or as a future physician. This is how it shaped me and shaped my passions and what I want to pursue. And that those 4 parts together always make the perfect sort of little sandwich for like a secondary essay or an interview answer, that it's like the same pattern over and over again. Yeah, I'll get off my soapbox now. We can move on. Yeah, so talk about gaps in your resume. As with any story, there are ups and downs from your application narrative. It's equally as important to talk about the challenges you have and you face, whether it be poor grades, a break, or a lack of certain kinds of experiences. And there are different qualities that you can show, like vulnerability, honesty, resilience, perseverance, accountability. I think those are all really important qualities to be showing in your application. If there's a gap in your resume of like just a year, you don't have to worry about it. If you're just taking one gap year, there's going to be no major questions about that. You can still do really interesting things, but you don't really have to worry about like explaining a gap like that. And usually these gaps or these breaks are way less important than we think. All you have to do is give a simple explanation about it when it's appropriate. And sometimes it's not always even appropriate. Sometimes you can just give the simple explanation. Gaps in your resume are really less significant than most people give it credit to. I think a lot of people think gaps are really significant, but most of the time, unless it's a substantial gap and a substantial sort of something that's going to leave someone with questions, then you don't really need to spend too much time hashing over the details of it. You can just briefly address it and sort of move on. And most of the time, that's sufficient. Yeah, so considering your whole application will allow you to start to plant the seeds before you even start writing your personal statement. Consider your work and activities, transcripts, and letters of recommendations will make your med school application much more impactful as a whole. So I think this is sort of getting at the idea of how do all these things fit together. So this even starts before the medical school application, before you start putting things into AMCAS. It starts earlier on. What courses am I deciding to take? What activities am I deciding to do? And then why did I pursue those courses and activities? How did that bring me here? Why do I want to go to med school? And how do these all fit together?
Oh, I think you're on mute, Nate. Can't hear ya. Unless, can everybody out there in the audience hear Nate? If you can hear Nate, please type it in the chat box. So I want to make sure I'm not, maybe it's me. Still can't hear you. Can any of the attendees hear Nate? He is muted, yeah. Can't hear him. Thanks, everyone, for letting us know. Well, in the meantime, when Nate gets that sorted out, I will go ahead and carry on with what he was mentioning. Another important aspect of building that narrative is providing context. So help the admissions committee understand the context behind your experience and achievements and what makes you really tick. You should be explaining why these certain activities or events were meaningful to you and how they have influenced your decision to pursue medicine. So it's all about really creating that story and making the admissions committee see from start to finish how this has really influenced and shaped your experience, as Nate mentioned. Okay, tips for developing an impactful narrative. Nate, are you still with us? No, can't hear you. Okay. So first step, be honest. Ensure that you're honest throughout your application. I think this kind of goes without saying. You don't want to be lying on your application. Fabricating aspects of your application could lead to some dire consequences, as you getting disqualified, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, expand and avoid redundancy. With each aspect of your application, remember to add a new piece of information that supports your narrative. Avoid repeating the same details over and over again. So you should be keeping it interesting within your application. Nobody wants to read something that's the same information over and over. So you should always kind of keep that in mind. Make sure you're going over your application and editing it. You never just want to submit a first draft, as with anything that you'll be doing throughout your, your school career or, these applications. You really want to make sure it's fine-tuned and it's the best that it can possibly be. Another tip, show, don't tell. As always, use your application to demonstrate the skills and qualities that will make you a great physician, as Nate touched on and really kind of explained. Don't simply say that you're a compassionate person. Explain. Instead, share an experience that really reflects that and leads the admissions committee to kind of see that for themselves. Wait, Nate, say something. No, can't hear you. I think maybe, yeah, he's probably gonna jump back in. Okay, so then I'll touch on embracing imperfection. So nobody's perfect. So sharing the lows of your journey and how you persevered is just as important as showing your highs. There's no linear path to success. Sometimes it goes up and down, and you really can learn a lot from your mistakes, and that can shape you going forward as a physician rather than somebody that's never made a mistake. Because once you get to that point where you make a mistake, you don't really know how to deal with it and bounce back. So embracing the imperfections on your path to med school shows growth, accountability, and resilience, which is so incredibly important when you're on your med school journey. Okay, I think I hear something.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes. All right, I'll let you take over.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Something I think about the platform that it's on, it did not like me disconnecting for a second. But I think we're back on now. We're good to go. So picking up from Julia, again, I think being genuine is one of the most important parts of your application. Nobody can hear me? At least some of you can hear me?
Okay, we've got one person here. Thank you for letting us know. Okay, if you can't hear Nate anymore, just type it in the chat box, and then I'll do some behind the scenes investigative work.
Okay. I think I'm getting feedback that most of you can hear me now. Hopefully it's at least recorded if you missed anything. So you can always go back and watch any parts that if you just missed a couple minutes there. Cool. So being genuine, you want to tell your story in your own voice. You want to be honest and authentic about your experiences, motivations, aspirations. Admissions committees value sincerity and authenticity. We can 99% of the time, we can 99% of the time tell when you're being honest about an experience. And that means if you like absolutely hated that one volunteering experience, don't choose that as your most meaningful experience for your AMCAS application, because that probably wasn't the most meaningful experience to you. Or don't talk about it at length in your personal statement. Pick the things that really do resonate with you, because we want to see through your activities who you are as a person. Customize your narrative to each application in school, highlight experiences and qualities that connect with each program's values and missions. This is really important for the secondaries component, not important for the primaries component. Do not apply to 20 schools and then call out one school in your personal statement. That's not going to end well. But in your secondaries, you want to be really specific. Go to the school's website, look at their values, look at their mission statement, look at the types of clinical training opportunities they have, programs they offer, things that make them unique. It's like dating. You want them to like you, but they want you to like them back. So it is about demonstrating that you have done your homework, you've read up on the school, and you know you have your reasons for applying to the school, and you know exactly why you want to apply to that school. Be concise and clear. You don't have a whole lot of space in these applications. You really, a lot of times, have to get to the point and do it in a really concise way. The best way to do that is you can start to overwrite, and then you can cut back and clear things up. Take out the things that are non-essential, but still get your message across. Connect your experiences. Yeah, look for common themes or connections among your experiences. Show how the activities or accomplishments contribute to your overall career narrative. Again, just tying in this overall theme of the application. Awesome. Whoa, I did that in record time. I'm so impressed with myself. Sorry, y'all. I probably went through that very quickly, but it tends to be the Q&A that people have the most interest in. So we shall open it up to questions, and I'm happy to go back over anything that I've covered. Try to keep the questions as relevant as possible. But if there are some other things that aren't like completely out of left field and still related to the admissions process, I probably do have some time for it, considering we went through that really quickly.
While the questions pour in, I'm wondering if you can give an example of a narrative that you've seen that has really proven to be really strong in these applications.
Yeah, I can actually think of a narrative from the last client that I completed the whole admission cycle through with. So one who is matriculating, picking a final medical school in the next coming days. But this applicant in particular had a lot of experience working in politics and didn't actually know they wanted to go to medical school until later, sort of in the college journey, and they were initially sort of leaning towards a career in politics. So a lot of their extracurriculars were maybe less traditional medical school experiences. Like there was less volunteering or less clinical shadowing because they had spent more time being involved with political organization, shadowing with representatives and working on congressional campaigns and doing those kinds of activities. So we sort of had to take a step back and be like, okay, we don't have as many of the traditional med school activities, but I think that's actually a strength of this application. There's something that makes you unique and really interesting to the admissions committee. So based on identifying some of the candidates' interests and sort of listening to the candidate talk about their passions working in the political sphere and how that connected to medicine and how that brought them to medicine, we're then able to really craft this really effective application through the personal statement and through the extracurriculars, and then again through the secondaries, talking about how this applicant wanted to bridge their work working clinically in medicine with the public policy space. So doctors working as political advocates to advocate for patient change, policy changes that affect their patient populations. And because this applicant had these untraditional experiences, they had learned some of these lessons and developed these really strong passions for the intersection of policy and medicine. And there's a lot of medical schools that offer MPH programs with policy emphasis, or just public health program, sort of that bridge the work between public health and policy, or even masters of public policy programs with focus on healthcare. So then for each individual school, we could sort of talk about that and their emphasis and interest in rural medicine and advocating for resources to make public policy changes that could create tangible differences and resources in the rural medicine setting. So that, I think, is one thing that really stood out to me as like an effective use of creating an entire application narrative. Like, we had it in the personal statement, we had it in this in the experiences. They had taken some like policy related classes in their activities, and then it came through again in the secondaries, being like, this is how I think this really fits with the mission of your school. And it really resonated quite well with a lot of schools that had that sort of interest in rural medicine, or maybe more of a public health focus or lens.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in. First question from Braden. How do you avoid inflating experiences and remain genuine? Some things I really want the admissions committee to know, but it sounds like I'm reaching when expanding on small interactions.
Yeah, that is a toughie. I think that comes to be like one of the $1 million questions, is like, how do we show instead of telling? Like, through, like, we want to really genuinely like get our point across, but we don't want to be too abrupt with like, I am a virtuous, compassionate, empathetic human being who would make a really good doctor. We want to lean away from that, but still really like demonstrate those characteristics implicitly. I would talk like, in terms of like inflating experiences, if to you it is a genuine experience and you're not inflating it, then that in and of itself is genuine. Like, if you are being genuine and authentic to yourself, then there is no inflation going on. We're just trying to get an idea of who you are as a candidate. That being said, be really realistic with the stuff that you write and the stuff that you put in there. And it can always be really helpful to have a friend or a family member or an experienced like admissions counselor or a consultant help you with that component of the application if you're sort of struggling with like, how do I write this? And it takes something that gets better with practice. Each time you do it, it gets a little easier. So my first advice would be just to start off writing it out. If it's hard to figure out the words to communicate it, just try to write it out at first, and you'll come back to it and you'll edit it. And sometimes I think that like small interactions can be really meaningful and they can be really purposeful. Frame the experience overall as a whole, like what kind of setting experience you were gaining this kind of interaction in, what was the extracurricular, and then why that individual interaction was really meaningful to you. And I think if you are being genuine, it's going to come across as genuine and authentic and not inflated. I hope that answered your question, Braden. If you have any follow-up questions on that, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'll try to circle back on it.
Amazing. Thanks, Nate. Okay, another question from Alexa. Hello, I'm an undergraduate student and have a full ride scholarship that has taken a lot of my time, and it's been difficult to acquire a lot of voluntary/shadowing hours. Do you have a minimum of hours I should have before applying?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alexa. And I think that's a really common question throughout for a lot of medical school applicants. There's no magic number and there is no magic threshold. I talked about sort of the point of like diminishing returns for me. And for me, that happened like aroundish 200 hours with volunteering. That doesn't mean that every applicant has to have hundreds and hundreds of hours of volunteering or clinical shadowing. it's what makes sense for you as an applicant and what you can do time-wise. I think volunteering and clinical shadowing are really important to demonstrate your interest in medicine, but you can also demonstrate your interest in medicine through other activities and other opportunities. So there is no minimum number of hours. If you're worried about not having enough exposure to the field of medicine to actually know whether or not you're really passionate about going into medical school, or maybe you're sort of teetering between medical school and PA school or nursing school, I would encourage you maybe take some time during a gap year or a couple gap years to gain more clinical experience and clinical exposure. I will be completely honest with you all now. I did not do any formal clinical shadowing. I worked as an emergency department scribe, and that gave me a lot of really great clinical exposure. And it was really cool because I had a lot more responsibility than most people who do clinical shadowing have. I worked in a clinical research department, same thing. I was interacting with physicians. I had a lot more responsibility. I was paid. I got all of the clinical exposure, probably a lot more clinical exposure than I would have gotten through shadowing. And I got paid for it, and I learned a lot more than you typically do when shadowing. Shadowing and volunteering are both really important activities to identify your interest in medicine, but it's not the only way that you can identify your interest in medicine.
Amazing, thank you. Question from Fiza, I believe that's how you pronounce it. If I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, my apologies. Is talking about mental health in our personal statement / application a red flag for med schools? I see a lot of people advising against it, but it's a big reason why I want to go into medicine in the first place.
Oh, that is such a toughie. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers on that one. I would personally, as a former medical school admissions committee member, I would have never dinged a candidate for talking about mental health in their application. That being said, there are people from a variety of backgrounds on the admissions committee, and that sometimes you have some more old school personalities on the admissions committee who maybe are not quite as progressively minded in that aspect. So for me personally, no, I never would have dinged an applicant. I think the context of it is really important. And I think if you chose to do that self-disclosure in the personal statement of a medical school application, it's really important to focus on resilience and how that experience taught you resilience and why that resilience shaped you into a good future medical school candidate. Contextually, it's really important. It's not always going to be appropriate for everyone's story to talk about mental health, but in some situations, I've advised people that I think it's okay to talk about that. You have to recognize that for personal statements, this is going to every medical school. So you can't really control which medical schools are seeing it or who you're exactly telling it to. You're just telling it to everyone across the board. You're telling them that story. And that's true for everything that we put in our personal statements. So if you're really concerned about like certain schools, that being said, one last perspective on this is if you are an absolutely incredible applicant and there are going to be medical schools all over the country wanting you, sometimes it's a tool where you can say what medical schools really fit with my values. However, if you're like, I just need that one admission, maybe it's something that you keep a little bit closer. You keep it a little more guarded. And then if you feel comfortable later on in an interview or a secondary, knowing the medical school, then you can throw it in there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Another question from Duozon. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. How do I translate personal volunteering or community hours in my application? I've been engaging in the donation drive for homeless people and offering health/dance sessions for senior citizens. How can I make use of that in my application?
Yeah, so I think these are two examples of activities that fit really well in your extracurricular, your activities section or extracurricular activities section. I think it's really important that you can like sort of talk about those activities and highlight what you learned from those activities. When you're working in the activities section, avoid treating it like a resume. We don't need to know all your roles and responsibilities. We want you to, again, show rather than tell. So sort of focus on maybe covering some of those roles and like giving a good idea of what the activity actually entailed. But also, if you have the space, giving a little bit of an anecdote, a story, maybe just a sentence or two. It's not a whole lot of space in the activities section, but it's really effective when you're able to merge the two to talk about this is the experience of what I did and this is what I learned from the experience. From just looking at those two activities, it seems like you may have a passion for working with like underserved populations, and are really interested in maybe that aspect of medicine is like working with underserved or neglected communities in medicine. So that's sort of a narrative that you could start to explore throughout the other parts of your application and maybe start to frame it in your personal statement. But I think just in general, zooming out a little bit, so this question is applicable to everyone in the room right now, is you can start to look at those activities and say, why did I do those activities? What were the reasons that I chose to engage in those activities? And then what did I gain from those experiences? What did I learn from those? And how is that important to shaping who I am going to be as a doctor, as a physician? What lessons did I take away from those that put me further down my path?
Amazing. Such a great answer. Thanks, Nate. I think those are all of the questions that we've had. So I think it might be best to wrap it up here unless we have another question that trickles in. But I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us for this webinar. I know it was super insightful, and I hope everybody learned at least something. Nate, thank you so much for your insights. I, for one, really appreciated your detailed responses, and I'm sure all of our attendees did as well. Just want to flag that if you didn't catch it in the first couple of minutes of the webinar, that we will be sending this out. So if you kind of need a review or a refresher, or maybe you missed something, we'll be sending this out to all attendees tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I want to thank you all again for joining, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Check out, oh, we got a question. Okay.
That's okay. I figured I'll hang out for a minute, a couple minutes as well. Okay. If anybody has to head out, get a little extra of your evening back. It was great to meet y'all. Thank you for letting me provide my insights to you, and I wish you all the best of luck on your medical school or professional school application journeys. You should walk in the room with some confidence. You're already a great candidate. And then the question in the chat is, do you have any advice specific to non-traditional candidates? I'm looking to apply to PA school after being an at-home parent for 20 years to 3 kids, 2 of whom have developmental disabilities. Megan, I really commend you. I've worked with several medical students who have these non-traditional journeys, and people who transfer into the medical field after non-traditional journeys always have really great reasons, and they know exactly what they want out of their career, and they're so driven when they get there. So I think it's an incredible and brave decision to make, to like go down this path. I think in terms of non-traditional candidates, I think you want to shop around for schools a little bit. Look at schools that's going to be a good fit for you lifestyle-wise. Obviously something that is really going to be comfortable to you and your family, as well as I think it's important once you start to get into the process of interviewing, seeing what the average student population is like, seeing if there are other people from non-traditional backgrounds, because that'll be really helpful to just having a support network versus everyone coming from more traditional backgrounds. I think a lot people coming from non-traditional backgrounds have a lot of strengths in their applications, actually. The reasons why I say that is because when you're reading thousands of applications, the non-traditional applications tend to be the most interesting applications we read. They stick out the most because they're the most different. So it's really taking those non-traditional experiences and turning them into opportunities. using all of that like whole catalog of non-traditional life experience to tell your story and your journey and how it brought you to medicine. I think there's a lot of things in stories you can probably tell of learning of just being an at-home parent, as reasons and skills that I think could make an incredibly compelling personal statement or narrative that would be like, there are a lot of things you probably learned from being an at-home parent that would prepare you very well for a career in medicine. Just because when you're working with patients, you are a care and service provider to them. And there's more similarities than differences in some of those ways. So really focus on finding that Venn diagram of similarities between your non-traditional experiences and how those are applicable to medicine.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I think we also had another question from Rakesh. Where can we find good examples of successful statements? I'm assuming successful personal statements is what it means.
Yeah. I think there are different resources. Am I allowed to? I can just share my favorite resource, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. My favorite are the Harvard 50 personal statements. Those are the best. They are the most interesting. They are the most well-written personal statements of anything I've ever read online, and I've done a lot of searching. The reason why those Harvard 50 personal statements are so good is because they tell very interesting stories and they do it very effectively. And even when they're not the most interesting stories, they still tell them very, very effectively. They have a lot of really good examples and they fall into these bigger buckets. Like there's an influential figure in your life, an impactful experience. I can't remember the other 6 general ones, but you start to figure out like, okay, I maybe fall into the influential figure category. There was somebody who was an influential figure, or there was a really impactful experience I had that drove me into medicine. Read through their examples from that category, learn how people convey those kinds of stories effectively, and then start about writing your own personal statement. There are probably some other good resources scattered about online. I haven't fully looked for them. That was the best resource I've ever found, though. And I wish I would have found it sooner. I didn't even have it in time for my own medical school application. But once I found it, I was like, these are really good.
Amazing. Thank you. All right. Any last questions trickling in? We'll wait a couple minutes to see if anybody else has any other questions. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have for tonight. If you do have a question that maybe will come up like after you're done reviewing the slide or whatever, just feel free to email us and we'll connect you with an admissions counselor that can help you out with that. And like I mentioned, we'll be emailing this out tomorrow for your review. I want to say thanks again so much. Hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great night. Bye.
Yeah, great to meet you all. Thank you so much. Bye.